This morning, while these issues obviously cannot be ignored, we will focus mainly on the situation within Mexico, particularly the country's institutional and political challenges, at a moment when Mexico's presidential campaign for the July 2018 elections is already well underway. The title gets right to the point: what's wrong with Mexico and how to fix it. There is no one better to tell us what is happening, enrich our understanding, and stimulate our thinking than Denise Dresser. Denise is many things, very hard to encapsulate. She's a distinguished political scientist, teaches at ITAM in Mexico, is an accomplished analyst and columnist at Reforma, and also in the news weekly Proceso. She is one of Mexico's most highly recognized, visible, and influential commentators, with how many Twitter followers? 4 million Twitter followers? Something like that. 3.4. Twitter. 3.4 million Twitter followers. Whether one fully agrees with her views or not, she is certainly not ignored. Denise has written many books and co-edited 2 best-selling collections of essays by prominent Mexican women, one in 2004, the other in 2010, and produced a television documentary based on that first book. She also collaborated on a book of political satire. Her most recent book, El País de Uno, Reflexiones para Entender y Cambiar a México, was a bestseller for over a year. She's a fearless champion of democracy, justice, gender equality, and human rights. For her steadfast dedication to those causes, she was recently awarded the Legion of Honor by the French government. I think it was the highest distinction given by the French government to either citizens or foreigners. As if that weren't enough, Denise is a personal friend and also a good friend of the dialogues. She was a visiting senior fellow here in 1994 and 1995 and has spoken at many dialogue events on a range of topics. In 2008, she contributed a terrific chapter on Mexico to the 3rd edition of the Dialogue Project and volume, Constructing Democratic Governance. It was entitled Dysfunctional Democracy, which might be a good title for the next edition, but for a chapter on the United States. It's a pleasure to welcome Denise Dresser.
Thank you very much for braving the rain to come and hear me speak about my country. El telepresidente, el copetudo, el copetesaurio. These are the nicknames that have been given to Enrique Peña Nieto, a president with a 12% approval rating, the lowest level of acceptance in Mexico since polls began. These are the epithets with which he's been baptized after promising to move Mexico, but now many believe that in the wrong direction. We've moved from delirium to disenchantment, from the blissful honeymoon to the acrimonious divorce, from the presidential sash that Peña Nieto showed off to the point where most believe that it is too big for him. We no longer speak of the Mexican moment, but rather of the Mexican morass, where the PRI can still win elections, as it might do in the state of Mexico, but with declining margins and worse perceptions. An era of political regression and social resistance in the face of its implications. Because it's now become clear that the Peña Nieto project entailed an attempt to re-centralize power, but not an effort to remodel and reconstruct the state. An ambitious but ultimately ill-fated project based on reforms, but not enough of them, built upon corruption and undone by it. It didn't seek to make the pie bigger, but to slice it up among party stalwarts and privileged contractors. It didn't seek to combat impunity, but rather take advantage of it. Today, Mexico is saddled with a government that was featured only 2 years ago on the cover of Time magazine as saving Mexico, with 11 structural reforms, many of them quite positive in their intent, that were celebrated at the time of their approval, but diluted or sabotaged at the time of their implementation. Mexico basically accepted top-down reforms without seeking bottom-up consensus. Accepted, in the case of energy and telecoms reform, a regulatory framework that has been too weak to contain the veracity or the crony capitalist tendencies of participating consortiums. Accepting, in the case of education reform, a rollout that didn't take into account the views of entrenched unions unable to comprehend what the reform entailed, and thus it has stalled. And then the summary executions by the military in Tlatlaya, the disappearance of 43 students in Ayotzinapa, and the involvement of the municipal, state, and federal police in a case that to this day remains unsolved. And then the corruption and the conflict of interest revealed by the White House, our version of it, the Casa Blanca, the house in Malinalco and Ixtapan de la Sal, and the scandal involving the constructor OHL and Odebrecht, the massacre of civilians by the federal police in Tanhuato, growth estimates that are falling, and homicide rates that are rising. The recent and fundamental report on inequality, written by Gerardo Esquivel, that shows how 16 Mexican multimillionaires have a fortune today equivalent to 9% of GDP. 5 years ago, that was 2%. The liberalization of gasoline prices at a time of economic anxiety, coupled with the devaluation of the peso, as we all know, a psychological measurement for many regarding the stability and the prospects of the country. As a result, today Peña Nieto is the lamest of all lame ducks, a duck that limps painfully, slowly on one foot, with almost a year and a half remaining in his term, a year and a half that many Mexicans, as the polls reflect, view as without hope, without leadership, without exit. Disapproved by public opinion and the international press, a failed presidency at the helm of a state that seems unable to fulfill its primordial duties to assure stability, security, growth, human rights, the rule of law. April was the most violent month in Mexico's history. And it's not just a question of society's bad mood, the mal humor social, as he has stated. The numbers don't lie. The data doesn't lie. Look at the downgrading of Mexico done by Moody's and Standard & Poor's, the level of indebtedness that former finance minister and today foreign minister Luis Videgaray promoted, the resignation of the head of the central bank, who was asked to stay on for 6 months more, in the light of what many think could be an impending crisis, end of sexennial crisis, of the sort we lived through at the end of the Salinas period in 1994. And it's true that part of the problem is not of Peña Nieto's undoing, not the fall in the price of oil or the uncertainty created by the election of Donald Trump and his expressed intention to use Mexico as a whipping boy. But the Peña Nieto administration is responsible for permitting Mexico's internal debt to grow to 50% of GDP, for allowing government spending to be channeled in an opaque fashion to salaries for high-level bureaucrats, to electoral cycles, to corrupt deals, to the intense promotion of his own image. The Mexican government spent and spent, but the economy didn't grow. The Mexican government spent, but not on public investment in infrastructure, for example, but on state-sponsored cronyism. Mexico's problems have been compounded by the global context, yes. Yet a large part of the blame, I insist, does reside on economic mismanagement by Videgaray and his team, who never fulfilled promises to rationalize public spending, who reneged on their commitment to maintain a balanced budget, who with their actions, politically and clientelistically motivated, increased the debt in an irresponsible fashion, and who by doing so, and this is prior to Trump getting elected, generated a level of distrust that undermined investor confidence in structural reforms, who by their decisions and omissions and with a corruption that became a corrosive acid that ran through the narrative of structural reforms, produced a deficit of credibility among domestic and international investors that has led to capital flight and speculation against the currency, and to levels of inequality that we hadn't seen. Now, inequality and concentration of wealth and cronyism are structural problems that have grown over time. They are systemic problems because rent-seeking and the permissiveness, for example, of fiscal policy have been rules, not exceptions. So this is not a tale of rapacious neoliberal markets, but rather of inefficient, manipulated markets. Growth simply cannot take place within the context of a state that lacks the credibility to assure equity, regulate monopolies, assure accountability regarding Casas Blancas and so many other instances of cronyism. Mexico's lackluster performance, coupled with corruption, has led to the emergence of widespread societal discontent. And you've seen this growing March after March after March, spearheaded by independent journalists like Carmen Aristegui, currently off the air, by human rights defenders, by activists who are calling for an end to the war on drugs and the decriminalization of marijuana, by students, by those who decry the gasolinazo for the many, accompanied by the preservation of privileges for the few. As Mexicans today, we are witnessing selective austerity with large cuts to education, justice, public investment, the fight against corruption, and programs to prevent violence, but increases in the budget for Congress and the judiciary and political parties. A historic level of government revenue via taxation, and a government that continues to spend so much and so badly that it has to resort to taxing gasoline in order to support its profligate behavior, with cuts that aren't focused where they should be. And thus the belt tightening seems like a demand that the political class places on the population, but not on itself. The Peña Nieto government and political parties that still support it don't have enough resources for highways, schools, or ports, or hospitals, but do have enough funds to provide the Senate, for example, with a 7.6% increase in its budget. In other latitudes, governments have fallen for much less, for less grievous mistakes, for less blatant corruption, but Mexico simply doesn't have a mechanism for impeachment or removal. So the best that we can hope for is damage control until the next presidential election in July of 2018. And I would say that the root of this implosion is largely corruption. Conflicts of interest covered up, private enrichment with public goods allowed, and this is due to the following paradox. And this would, it would be something new that I would add to a chapter on democratic governance if I were asked to write it today. Democracy in Mexico has not meant more controls, but more corruption. Alternancia, the rotation in power of different political parties, has not stopped abuses, it has exacerbated them, normalized them. Today, 78 out of every 100 Mexicans believe that corruption will increase this year, because pluralism and alternancia do not combat corruption per se. Democratization in Mexico has led to the dispersion of power and the opening of many more windows to do business with public resources. A weak rule of law allows it. Greater decentralization of the budget entails greater discretionality in its use. More influence of Congress in the disbursement of the budget entails a higher probability of what we've seen, payoffs, or so-called moches for public works. national and local legislative bodies are not a check and balance for corruption, but rather part of the machinery that makes it possible. And then there are 32 governors with a great deal of money and zero accountability. All of these political players, beneficiaries of the enormous cash liquidity in the national economy with few fiscal controls. Beneficiaries of the increase in public spending and what the finance ministry channeled into some public works. Beneficiaries of the bags of cash to pay for political campaigns, of the cartloads of money that flow from the president's office to political parties and the media, along with the national and local media full of government-sponsored, and perhaps I should credit the phrase to Donald Trump, sponsoring fake news, publishing stories and photos of governors inaugurating clinics or hugging indigenous women, while at the same time they've been basically stealing their states blind. Corruption in Mexico is a mechanism of mutual protection, and opposition parties don't denounce corruption as vehemently or as consistently as they should, because instead of avoiding the PRI's behavior, they've emulated it. And governors have perfected the state-by-state model for perfect pillaging. There's the case of Veracruz and its governor, Javier Duarte, currently in prison after being on the lam for months. Veracruz is a microcosm of how an omnipotent governor could become a despoiler. The PRI's standard operating procedure, there it is, for creating fake businesses, channeling money to them, closing them later. And what no longer surprises, but does create indignation, is the indifference of the authorities while this was happening. The lackadaisical attitude of the Attorney General's office that received 32 official complaints from the Federal Audit's Office, but never acted on them. Probably, and this is the speculation that still needs to be proved, because Duarte had been funneling money into Peña Nieto's presidential campaign and other state elections, as was the case with so many other governors, accused but currently untouched. And while the PRI waits for the scandal of this week to cover up the scandal of last week, which now you can empathize with, given that it's happening in your own country, what is becoming increasingly obvious is the PRI's modus operandi, turning the country's fragile democracy into a partisan kleptocracy, using their time in government, because they knew that they only had 6 years, to squeeze those who finance it via their taxes. The PRI is used to stealing, and the population has become used to that happening. Mexico was the birthplace of the perfect dictatorship, and now it is the home of the perfect pillage. Analyst Edgardo Buscaglia is right. Frequently organized crime in Mexico, the best form of organized crime, is in the government itself. At the state level, among ministers, among municipal presidents, among those who enabled drug kingpin El Chapo Guzman to escape not once, but twice. Judicial system truncated transition, failed representation, institutionalized impunity, simulation, regression. Instead of responding to public interest, the political class has promoted private ones. Instead of resolving problems, the institutional framework has been kicking them forward. Instead of generating incentives for representation, current rules impede that from happening. Applauded but incomplete rules for electoral competition that we celebrated in the 90s have only perpetuated the rotation of party stalwarts from all parties, inaugurated by the PRI but emulated by other parties, thus creating a skin-deep democracy that preserves the privileges of a political elite that jumps from post to post without ever having to be accountable, because we still don't have re-election, which only kicks in 2018, and with a series of controls that take away its capacity to actually act as a mechanism to punish those who abuse power. And perhaps that explains why only 4% of the population today trusts political parties, and only 10% of the electorate believes that legislators legislate in their name. Mexicans look at political parties of all ilks and see a story of priización, of organizations that promised to embody something different but ended up acting the same way. They see pluralism in terms of political promises, but unilateralism in the way that they govern. They see political parties that are corrupt, that refuse to be accountable, that refuse to reduce outrageously high public financing for themselves, and that instead of combating impunity, often perpetuate it. Because what we discovered? That Mexico's dysfunctional democracy that I wrote about in 2008 was created through electoral rules that created counterproductive results. They assured elite rotation, but not citizen representation. They created competition among parties, but not rules to hold them accountable. They instituted a mechanism, yes, for power sharing, but not a way of holding that power up to public scrutiny. So those electoral reforms that we applauded, that many of us participated in, have produced political parties that are like cartels, and they operate as such. They've become employment agencies for a political class financed by citizens, but impermeable to their demands. Today, 60% of Mexicans don't know who they're going to vote for, or if they will. And this is the context in which the 2018 presidential election is going to take place, with the two front runners in the polls, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, Margarita Zavala. Briefly on Margarita Zavala. Dignified, irreproachable, respected, the probable candidate of the National Action Party, always with the precise word, the perfect gesture, the perfect tone, always with the sensibility that her husband, former President Felipe Calderón, seemed to lack. Margarita was and always has been that, the loyal wife, the good wife, as in the television series of the same name. But that position of unconditional loyalty to her husband is what makes her presidential bid so troublesome. Because of what she knew and did not speak up about, because of what she allowed to happen and did, because of the failure of the National Action Party over 12 years. She's not just any ordinary citizen. She's not a political tabula rasa. She was a collaborator. She was an accomplice. She listened, she counseled, she applauded. She wasn't simply a spectator. She's too smart for that. But precisely because she wasn't a passerby, the questions and the criticisms that are leveled at her husband's tenure need to be directed to her too. From a privileged vantage point, she saw the mistakes that Calderón made, and yet, as of this day, she has not acknowledged them or distanced herself from them. She is therefore offering a facsimile version of her husband's tenure. And she still doesn't understand this. She doesn't understand that Calderón's tenure is condemned for the violence it produced, for the selective application of the rule of law it allowed, for the insecurity, the violence, the counterproductive war on drugs that he launched. So in order to win her party's nomination and win the election, tact and amiability and a Mexican rebozo, which is her trademark, will not be enough. Margarita seems to lack a vision for Mexico capable of generating fire in the belly, indignation with the status quo, trust in public policies that are capable of shaking up a disillusioned and disenchanted, divided country. And what we've seen up to now are small proposals with little boldness, with little imagination, and with no distancing from her husband. So if she wants to transcend, she should learn from Alicia Florrick, the protagonist of The Good Wife. In the end, she didn't care about being a loyal spouse. She preferred to win. And as for the current frontrunner in the polls, López Obrador running for the third time, he seems to be transitioning from the rancorous republic to the amorous republic, from the raised fist to the extended hand, offering an anticipated amnesty to everyone in the PRI if they will let him win. From the tropical messiah to the pragmatic politician. That's how he's trying to reposition himself, reinvent himself. No longer as the provocateur who is going to ignite the prairie, but as the politician, the only one who can put out the fire. No longer as the rabble-rouser who damned the institutions to hell in 2006, but as the realist who says he might remodel them, although he's not quite sure he actually believes in institutions. All of this would be good if it were a sign of political learning, if his shifting stance demonstrated that he has recognized the mistakes he made since 2006. And now in his third bid to win the presidency, perhaps López Obrador has changed. The candidate who was deemed as a danger for Mexico is trying to calm himself down, broaden his spectrum of supporters, helped today, and that's why he's the front runner of the polls, by an electorate that largely hates the PRI, distrusts the National Action Party, and seems willing to give López Obrador a chance. Meanwhile, he's attempting to slide towards the center of the political spectrum in order to finally head a successful presidential bid from there. Now, what I've mapped out is that the internal challenges are great, and the external challenges are perhaps greater. Because now we know that Donald Trump is not a normal politician who will moderate himself, but rather, I believe, an autocrat who will empower himself. We've witnessed the arrival into the Oval Office, and this is completely on the record, of a man without any sort of experience in public office, with a half-visceral, half-vengeful temperament, incapable of controlling his impulses on Twitter, incapable of addressing the xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism that runs rampant among many of his followers. The first president in the US, a candidate who won despite being a chronic liar, a sexual predator, a tax evader, a racist whose triumph was celebrated by the Ku Klux Klan, a negotiator whose only international experience has been inaugurating hotels and golf clubs. As David Remnick wrote in The New Yorker, and I fully agree, there's no other way to put it. This is an American tragedy. And now he will misgovern, as we have seen, with weakened checks and balances, with a Republican majority willing to go along as long as it gets tax cuts, in control of Congress, lambasting the media and the courts, picking fights with allies that are unnecessarily turning into enemies, using, and there is a perverse justice in this, using dominant party rule, which is what we've lived through for so many years, to unleash the Mexicanization of American politics, using unrestrained presidential power to deport, endanger trade agreements, defund culture and the arts, reject global warming, deregulate Wall Street, and whatever else pops into his head. And the problem for us is that the reality of free trade is endangered, the bilateral relationship threatened, a neighbor from our perspective gone wild, the dream that was North America perhaps coming to an end. I'm not so sure that will happen, but we never know what might come out of the White House even this afternoon. The forced Megxit that is happening at our expense. And therein the probable results, possible results, a constitutional crisis, a confronted, polarized society, a breakdown of international alliances, perhaps an impeachment, and if not, a great deal of damage. So what do we do? Many in Mexico today are feeling bewildered, anxious, afraid, overwhelmed by the feeling that in the current context, the country has no remedy or solution or path or salvation, or maybe it's López Obrador. When I believe the real answer is elsewhere. It lies in using this internal and external jolt to clean up our own house. It lies in understanding the foundational problems of corruption and impunity and the absence of the rule of law. The World Justice Project recently published its comparative index of the rule of law, and the results from Mexico are disheartening. We fell 9 places in the past year to the 88th spot out of 133 countries, below Burkina Faso, Zambia, Tanzania, Iran. And the worst indicators have to do with corruption in the criminal justice system. For reasons we all know, a political class of all stripes that does not want to lose accumulated privileges and assured impunity, a national anti-corruption system that citizens managed to create from the bottom up that has started off very slowly and will require autonomous prosecutors, a rotten judicial system that hasn't been able to adapt to what was the great triumph of our generation, the introduction of oral trials and adversarial trials. A police that was created to be an instrument at the service of the powerful and not a mechanism for protection for ordinary citizens. Prosecutors that don't investigate, judges that close their eyes in the face of torture, and very troublesome for a country that managed to evade military coups for so long. A military that is gradually taking over the tasks of public security when it shouldn't. The illegal and unconstitutional behavior of the army vis-a-vis civilians and human rights violations has been allowed and now is being promoted by political parties through the Ley de Seguridad Interior. So what to do? The anti-corruption system is a small step in the right direction to denormalize what so many do and so few pay. But it's going to require an absolutely autonomous attorney general and not a friend of the president recently appointed and known as El Fiscal Carnal. It will require an autonomous anti-corruption prosecutor, a large enough budget, specialized tribunals, and public pressure that does not melt away. Otherwise, Peña Nieto and all those who benefit from the status quo will have triumphed by making Mexicans believe, as the president has argued, that the problem is cultural and that Mexicans are as corrupt as the people who govern them. So what are the 3 key areas to focus on? The future of the national anti-corruption system and the designations for the people who occupy key positions, the future of the autonomous Attorney General's office. It will be autonomous in 2018 according to the law, but Peña Nieto placed his friend who will automatically transit to head the new institution unless we stop this. The future of judicial reform, which according to a recent report by CIDAC, in many places, if we continue at the same rate of implementation, it's going to take us 11 years for oral trials to be established in a general way throughout the country. And finally, the Ley de Seguridad Interior, that the military is pushing in order to get constitutional protection for the illegal behavior it's been engaging in over the past 11 years, and the professionalization of police. And we're in a catch-22 situation because Calderón brought the military in, alleging that the police couldn't fulfill their obligations because they were corrupt and unprofessional, which is true. But by bringing the military in, alleging that the police don't work, you lose every incentive to professionalize the police. And without professional police, you simply do not have a rule of law. So as for Mexico, the country, we're going to have to prepare ourselves for uncertainty with an even keel, with patience, with vision. I've always said that we have to bring together the best minds and sit them down at the table, as we did in 1994, after the Colosio assassination, after the Zapatista uprising, the year we lived dangerously, and the year that devaluation wrought havoc on the country's economy. At that moment, instability led to unity, polarization led to negotiation. Saving Mexico mattered more than the struggle over who was going to govern it. And the country stepped away from the cliff via foundational pacts that led to the democratic transition. I believe that today the circumstances are more urgent, more threatening. The danger is larger and the political class is worse. As for the bilateral relationship, it is something that is discussed in Washington ad nauseum. There are many intelligent and valuable proposals. Buy time, give Trump enough rope so that he ends up hanging himself while Mexico seeks other partners, prepare to renegotiate Nafta and play hardball, allow the US to unilaterally withdraw and govern ourselves by the WTO rules. I mean, all of these proposals are on the table, and luckily the former negotiators of Nafta are prepared to renegotiate again. But fundamentally, what to do for Mexico transits through what type of country we want to be, because there are all these calls for unity. But I think the unity has to be around a model of economic and social development geared towards growing, competing, educating, democratizing, becoming more equal and more transparent, when we're being asked to unite behind a historic pattern that places us in an unfavorable situation time and again. The Mexican model based on extraction over inclusion, rent-seeking over innovation, cronyism that splits the pie instead of making it bigger, those are the true walls that Mexico faces, not the wall or the fence or the hedge on the border. Those are the walls that Mexico has built, created by Slim and his monopolies, by the PRI and corruption, by political parties and their lack of representativeness. So yes, by all means, unity, but around a Mexico that internal and external blows should force us to recreate. Unity to demand absolute transparency in government spending in light of el gasolinazo and the tax increase that entails. Unity to reduce party financing by 50%, a legislative initiative brought by an independent legislator currently stalled in Congress. Unity to fight corruption, even if it comes from Los Pinos. Unity to create a rule of law that actually works for ordinary people. Unity around a political class willing to reform itself and not only protect itself. Because Trump does kick and humiliate us, but we can and we will resist if we act like true patriots. And I use the word very deliberately in Mexico and here. Those who defend their country from strange enemies, as our national anthem says, extraños enemigos, and also from bad governments. The true patriots, as Mark Twain described them, those who defend their country always, and their government only when it deserves it. Finally, I don't think these are times for providential saviors. And many believe that these problems that I've outlined will automatically be resolved if we just vote for López Obrador, the right person. These aren't times for providential saviors or conservative nationalists or proto-populists or amiable wives of former presidents. As a wise friend told me, Jorge Ramos, these are times for citizens, for rebels, for women, for students, for movements against the status quo like Ahora and Nosotros that are emerging from civil society with claims of transparency, anti-corruption, and this is what I would expect, an honest, energetic, pungent debate that we need and deserve as a country, motivated by a phrase by Václav Havel that resonated with me since the first time I read it. The ability to do something because it is right and not because it will triumph. This is the opportunity to carry and defend and expand what we have achieved from below, because the political class is not going to do this. By marching, by mobilizing, by lobbying, by doing what we never thought we'd have to do, which is draft legislation. Insist on open, transparent designation for all posts. Demand a fiscal council to audit public spending, and multiple proposals that are out there that civic organizations and independent think tanks have been advocating, like a truly autonomous attorney general and an anti-corruption prosecutor. And I could go on. So that more Mexicans can stand tall having achieved what we never thought possible before. The National Transparency Institute, the right to choose in Mexico City, constitutional protections for gay marriage, the Ley 3 de 3, the National Anti-Corruption System, oral trials, independent journalism, this movement to create an independent judiciary. These are modest, indirect, long-term changes that are changing how power is exercised in Mexico. These are the achievements of our time. And this is where I'm inviting Mexicans and those here who care for us to stand, defending them as we fight for more. Mientras vamos por más. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise. That was absolutely terrific. And now that we're all cheered up, we have about a half hour, a little over a half hour for questions and discussion. Maybe if I could just start with one or two questions, and then I see people on the edge of their seats, so if you could just kind of be restrained for a few minutes, we'll certainly have time for your questions. But I guess the first thing is, if people were forced to ask themselves what's the most positive, redeeming sort of thing that Peña Nieto has done, it goes back to what you started with, which is the reform agenda. In your chapter for 10 years ago, you used the word inertia, paralysis, nothing happens. And here you had at the beginning this pretty significant agenda of reforms. You mentioned the disappointment that they've been diluted, they have been carried out, they have been managed politically very well. And I wonder if there's anything, if you were to single out anything that you think was a positive result of this process, either now that people feel immediately, the telecommunications or others, or whether you think over the long term that will benefit Mexico, that one could point to and say, well, he was able to achieve this reforms, and ultimately this is going to be good for Mexico.
I celebrated the reformist impulse. If you look at the foundational documents of the Pacto por México, many of the demands that were included there were things that those of us in civil society had been demanding for years. Telecoms reform, education reform, energy reform, reforms that were necessary in order to inject competition, to promote a market economy, in order to benefit consumers. And see, that for me is the true test of whether a structural reform works or not, whether it actually provides benefits to consumers who had been the victims of rent-seeking and crony capitalism for years. So I was one of those who applauded telecoms reform, who applauded energy reform because I thought that we couldn't continue with the state-led monopoly, rapacious and extractive. And then what happened to that reformist impulse? Well, if you look at the constitutional reforms, many of them deserve a positive check. But then when the time came to create the secondary legislation to actually put these reforms into place, that's when things went awry, or the political rollout or the political negotiation. Because what I mentioned in my talk was Peña Nieto did not work hard enough to create societal consensus for these reforms. He wasn't capable of explaining how they would actually benefit Mexicans. So the support that they should have gotten from below never existed. And there wasn't any support among the elites because it actually affected vested interests in telecoms and energy, the union, Pemex contractors, I mean, in many of the key areas. So the coalition for reform was very narrow, and the opponents were very entrenched. And given that there's no re-election, what did they do? The vested interest reached out to Congress, and when secondary legislation was actually written, what happened? A lot of the reformist impulse was diluted. You see it, for example, in telecoms reform, which should have been much more aggressive vis-a-vis Televisa and TV in general. It was very aggressive against Slim, and that was a good thing. And if I had to point out one of the positive effects, it's the fact that you can now actually contract a cellular phone and a line with AT&T and get better service at a better price. So Slim is facing competition, but AT&T has, I think, 7% of the market because it faces an extraordinarily entrenched competitor who also has managed to box in the regulatory authorities that were created for telecoms, and many rulings end up going in his favor. And I could explain what happened to each one of the reforms in this sense. You know, education reform. Instead of having a very savvy education minister who sat down with the unions and said, we're going to ask this of you: evaluations, compensation linked to performance. These are the sticks, but here are the carrots. The unions perceived it as completely punitive, as if they were being portrayed as the complete, absolute bad guys of the educational system when the government has been complicit in the creation of these rapacious unions. And so opposition started emerging in key states, and marches and blockades, and the government, instead of reaching out to society and explaining, well, you know, parents, your children deserve a better education and support the reform, the government ended up simply giving in for fear of unrest. So that's what happens when you don't have a broad enough political coalition for reform. And if you add to this the fact that many of the beneficiaries ended up being cronies of the president, when you have greater competition in infrastructure related to the energy sector, but then you see non-transparent licitations, bids that are immediately allocated without a licitación, and you see a powerful new group of entrepreneurs close to the president, close to the compact political class, benefiting from the reforms, then what happens? You get Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Because people don't see the direct impact, positive impact of the reforms. They see select few beneficiaries, and so they gravitate towards someone who simply wants to do away with the reformist intent, who has said that he's going to call for a referendum on energy reform and echarlo para atrás, end it if the referendum is successful. So governing by referendum, which, as you well know, throughout Latin America is an extremely dangerous route. So, you know, the bad implementation of good reforms is going to lead us to a proto-populist who rejects them. So
Okay.
that's my answer.
I have one other question, and then please try to. You mentioned, as we know, in Latin America, and I wonder if you could share a few thoughts trying to put what you see happening that you described so eloquently and powerfully here in Mexico in this sort of a regional context, and particularly on the issue of corruption, which is one that you really hone in on.
Right. Yeah.
How do you see what's happening in South America and other countries? You know, Peru, there's a former president who's in jail for 25 years for corruption and human rights, and there were the 3 presidents that succeeded him were also under investigation for Odebrecht. And so is this is Mexico the outlier, or is Mexico sort of part of this? How do you see it?
Mexico is definitely the outlier and the archipelago of impunity for one fundamental reason. Why are we not seeing investigations presidents fall or senators in jail, or a pattern that, a positive pattern that we've seen. Yes, it's generating political instability, but I think the fundamental cause is the correct one, going after corruption. Why are we not seeing what we've seen in Brazil, in Peru, Kaczynski coming out and declaring that anyone related to Odebrecht will not be able to participate in public licitations for I don't know how many years, or Guatemala for that matter. The fundamental reason, and it goes to the heart of something I mentioned in my talk, we do not have an independent judiciary. We do not have independent prosecutors. Why do you see these cases being investigated in other countries? While in Odebrecht, all of the contracts between Odebrecht and Pemex have been reserved for I don't know how many years. Why is it not a huge scandal in Mexico? Why does OHL continue to do what it does, despite accusations of malfeasance in other places? Because the Attorney General is the president's buddy. And before that, the Attorney General was the president's friend. And before that, the Attorney General was appointed by the president and ratified by the Senate in a pro forma fashion that does not entail a process of scrutiny, either by independent agencies within the government or by society itself. And the counterweights to this, that should be the Senate and the lower house, act in tandem with the president. So when you don't have an independent judiciary, what you get is the Mexican result, where what you see happening in other countries simply does not happen to us. And by the way, if you want to see, you're going to start seeing the results of that here. I mean, sadly.
Thank you. Why don't we open it up now? Please just tell us who you are. Be very brief, because we'll start with Peter, and just so we can get as many questions in as possible.
My name's Peter Quilter. I'm at the Kennedy School at Harvard. Energy reform. My question basically is, what happens to the energy reforms if AMLO becomes president? You've painted him as someone who is repositioning himself as a pragmatist, but he also says a lot of things. So what's your take on the energy reforms?
It depends on what happens in the election in the state of Mexico in June. It depends on whether his party wins that state or not. It depends if he wins the presidential election and with what margin, and what the composition of Congress is, and what the alliances he builds are like. So there's a lot of uncertainty because frequently with López Obrador, there is a big distance between what he says one day and what he says the next, and what he says to one constituency and what he says to the other constituency. So to those that are his base dura, he is saying, I'm going to repeal energy reform through a referendum, even though he constitutionally cannot do that. You cannot, you would have to, constitutional reforms cannot be repealed by a referendum. He would have to carry out another constitutional reform, which is a very complicated process in Mexico, and it requires ratification by all the states. I think that if he reaches office, he'll begin to discover that much of what he wants to do requires investment. It requires money. And the Mexican state doesn't have the money to invest. And you can't, to carry out many of the programs he intends to institute, he needs money flowing into Mexico. And therefore, I see him becoming more pragmatic on energy, perhaps carrying out some symbolic things like building a refinery, something of that nature to show that he's defending sovereignty. But I think his margin for maneuver in that realm is actually pretty limited.
Sir, in the back. I know there are a lot of questions, but I'll check one by one.
Thank you very much. My name is Samuel Segura. I come from the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva. So my question is concerning, you've mentioned, so in Mexico we've lived for 40 years now in a period of severe state delegitimacy, in fact. And so the Mexican government has been absolutely unable to carry out all the different measures that are needed to implement and to make the Mexican economy grow. Now, you mentioned that in order to do and implement and do these things, we need to bring in big political alliances. But then you also seem to hint at the fact that we need the right type of political alliances by bringing in the civil society and so on. But then there's a problem of accountability. You want the government to be accountable. You want political parties to be accountable. How is civil society going to be accountable? Because how do we know as citizens that civil society that seems to be speaking or appears to be speaking for citizens is actually speaking for citizens and not for hidden and vested interests?
It's actually a very good question that I'd never really thought about, because the civil society groups that I work with,
They're the good ones.
Exactly. Yeah. No.
That's what Trump says.
No. They've been in the fight for transparency and for accountability in public spending, and for the Ley 3 de 3, and Mexico Evalúa, and so many of them. Some of them at times, I think, have lacked, have been less aggressive than I would have wanted. Some have been too timid at times. I think we should have gone further with the Ley 3 de 3, but this is what happens when you build a coalition of 20 groups in civil society. I think, well, the difference it makes is that many of these organizations are not publicly funded, and they are, by the nature of their composition and their boards and so on, they're forced to be accountable. And I think what balances out some of the political interests of some of them is the plurality of interests in the coalition. I mean, there are groups from that are more center-right, like Causa en Común, and then you have Cencos, which is on the extreme left. So, Cencos isn't going to go into a political crusade with Causa en Común unless some common ground in terms of how they act responsibly is achieved.
Jose Briceño from Reforma.
Thank you very much. Many people in Washington, in the United States in general, feel that criticizing Mexico at this moment is some kind of a taboo, considering the threat of Trump and trade, immigration, and the wall and others. How do you see this? Are you frustrated that Friends of Mexico in the US does not point as hard as they can on the issue of corruption and rule of law?
Well, it is a very difficult situation, because much of what I've said here could be taken by the Trump administration and then used against us. Well, why should we renegotiate Nafta when we have such a corrupt and lawless partner? Why should we engage with Mexico when it's a country of criminals and rapists? A study just came out yesterday positioning Mexico as the second most violent country in the world, just underneath Syria in terms of just the number of deaths. I mean, we can desegregate it and see the differences, but just in terms of the volume of deaths. Why shouldn't we build a wall against a country like that? But if we look back in historical perspective, the US-Mexico relationship was on pretty good ground under Nafta. And the US had leverage to push Mexico to gravitate towards its better angels instead of the worst demons of its nature. Isn't this Lincoln? And now, at this point, I don't see that the US is interested in having that leverage. And unfortunately for us, it's when we most need it in a constructive way to say, these reforms that were pushing Mexico in the right direction need to be saved. But Mexico will only do it. I mean, USAID and many American agencies have been involved in the construction of the transition to oral trials for a decade now. It's not as if they were, simply standing by. They've received funding, training for judges. I mean, the US has invested in this. And we're sort of at a critical juncture where if we don't focus on the institutional reinvention or remodeling of the country, what we're going to get is someone who actually doesn't believe in institutions, which will mean a major regression. And simply believing that you can, I guess I'm paraphrasing Einstein, in terms of the violence, repeat the same strategy over and over again and expect different results. Well, we've been doing this, combating drug cartels for, what is it now, 2 sexennios, with worsening results. We're not getting better results. And to believe that sending more members of the army out there is going to solve the problem of not having good police, it's just going to put us in a worse situation. So I realize American friends are in a bind. But if the narrative is Mexico was headed in the right direction, and US-Mexico relations were in a pretty good place in terms of Nafta and collaboration on many fronts, why would you want a nationalist, a populist, a man who doesn't truly believe in institutions? Today, one of the surveys that electoral surveys, polls that came out, positions López Obrador in first place because of Trump, because he is perceived as the man who's going to defend Mexico's interests and truly be anti-American in a way that none of us in this room would want that to be the path that the US and Mexico head down in the next 6 years.
Yes, sir. We'll start. Yeah. There are a lot of questions, but we'll do the best we can. Just please be brief.
Gabriel España from the International Finance Corporation. No, quick question on the social presidential candidates or the the independent candidates. If you have any views, you have mentioned the role of civil society, and I was wondering if you have any views on the news.
I know and respect at least one of the independent candidates who you know from Washington, Emilio Álvarez y Casa. I think the chances of an independent winning in this election are 0. They would be much higher if López Obrador were not in the picture. But he's going to, strangely, capture the anti-establishment, anti-party sentiment, although he's been a member of the political establishment for 20 years and is actually the head of a party, but manages to position himself as the anti-systemic option. Independents would have fulfilled that role, and now they can't. What I can see them doing is what Álvarez y Casa did yesterday, which was to uncover and explain the cycle of corruption that allowed the PRI to use funding from OHL, the Spanish company, to finance political campaigns in the state of Mexico. So an independent can place items on the agenda, perhaps form part of the debate, and perhaps encourage López Obrador to reach out to more independent, undecided voters. Because today he's at 30% of the polls. I mean, if he wins, he may only win with 30% of the vote, leaving out, 40% of the electorate today undecided, people who don't know who to vote for or if they will. The undecided component of the Mexican electorate is growing. Nonpartisan people who don't identify with anyone. And independent candidates could possibly lead López Obrador to reach out to that constituency and try and convince it instead of demanding unconditional loyalty as he is demanding now.
Sir. Yes. We'll wait for a microphone.
It's already related to this last question. My name is Alejandro de la Fuente. I work at the World Bank as an economist. I appreciate your clear thinking, as always, Denise. Thank you for that. Just building on this last question, you mentioned the possibility of just energizing the society with a common candidate, maybe an independent candidate, even if you don't win the process, because you're just building into the agenda, some of these items and issues that are on top of the discussion. Have you entertained the possibility of yourself sort of running for this?
I jokingly said that I would consider it in it's like the Mexican version of The Daily Show. And the host asked me, well, would you run? And I said, well, I'd just come out of a meeting with the interdisciplinary group of independent people that the Inter-American Human Rights Commission sent for Ayotzinapa. And by the way, if you haven't read them, their 2 reports about Ayotzinapa are the most important documents to be published about Mexico in the last 10 years. Because they're not just about Ayotzinapa. They tell you why the rule of law doesn't work, and how our organized crime and drug traffickers infiltrate state governments and the police, and perhaps the military. And the report ends with a series of recommendations that are fundamental for anyone who wants to understand Mexico. But I'd just come out of a meeting with them. They were being kicked out of the country. I was very frustrated. And I said, well, if nobody deals with this issue, I might consider, throwing my hat into the ring. And I said this half jokingly, and it became a trending topic on Twitter, and suddenly I was in the polls. And I didn't do that, no, I didn't do that badly. I wasn't even running, and I was at like anywhere between 8 and 10% without having even declared a candidacy. But then I realized what Emilio and Jorge Castañeda and others have realized, that the barriers to entry for independence are so high. You get no financing, you need 1 million signatures, that wouldn't have been an issue. But the financing, when you have parties that are financed with public money and huge amounts of it, party financing has not been reduced because it's linked to the electoral roll call. Anytime anyone turns 18, parties get more money. So I would have had to go hand in hand to the business class of Mexico to ask for money, something that I couldn't see myself doing, and would have entailed speaking to the very people I've spent 15 years combating for oligopolistic and monopolistic practices. So unfortunately, independent candidacies were created to fail. And unless we change those rules, because what I see happening is if López Obrador wins, and please remember that this is not a foregone conclusion, because in 2006, he started the presidential race with 30 points, a 30-point lead, which he managed to throw out through mistakes that he made with the establishment against him. But he's his own worst enemy. He could lose, but if he wins, what's going to happen, really? We're going to waste another 6 years until we realize that the problems are systemic and that they have to do with institutional design and with rules for party financing and with the independence of the judiciary, all these issues that I've raised that do not form part of his platform or of his thinking. And so perhaps after 6 years, after people have experienced the disillusionment of someone who might do a couple of things right, particularly regarding inequality and social programs, but who will not address the fundamentals of institutional design. And then after 6 years, I think the time might be right for an independent candidacy.
Ramon?
Denise, thank you. Ramon Sortuche with Ford Motor Company. I mean, it's clear the upcoming Nafta discussions, when they ever finally start, are going to have an impact on the upcoming elections. How does a renegotiated agreement and/or how it plays out have to look like and/or play out to allow the current administration to sort of deem it a success, or to deem it sort of, like,
Which administration, well? Mexico or the?
Yeah, current, Peña Nieto. Sort of from a political context, I mean.
Right. I think anything that doesn't alter the status quo substantially would be viewed as a success. Anything that maintains basically the rules that we have now would be viewed as a success. Now, the problem is that Mexico may have to allow the Trump administration to say that the US has won by certain things that Mexico have to give up. So even if we win in terms of maintaining most of the status quo, we may have to accept the loss publicly and politically for the current administration so that Trump gets a political victory out of it and stops using us as a whipping boy, or at least in that area. So even if the Peña Nieto administration wins, it's going to lose in terms of public opinion. And it's already lost because I don't see a president who is at 12% in the polls, and according to some, he's at 6% of the polls. How do you bounce back from that? And how do you bounce back with something that, in the mind of your lead presidential candidate, López Obrador, is still a contentious issue, which is Nafta, when it shouldn't be anymore?
Yes, good morning. Guillermo Reyes with BMW Group from Germany. My question is, what role do you see the international community playing in steering or pressuring politically, the Mexican government in avoiding the cliff, as you mentioned, in that same case as in 1994? And by that matter, how do you see also international companies, multinationals in Mexico, what role can also they play in steering or supporting the government to make the right decisions, to go in the right direction? So it'd be international actors and also multinationals.
Yeah. When throughout the campaign and in the first couple of weeks of the Trump administration, when he really lashed out against American companies in Mexico, I was surprised to see American companies just simply kowtowing or keeping silent or saying that they were going to move their installations or basically running very scared. And I was happy to see the companies that didn't, that stood their ground, that said, we're not leaving. And what I've been able to discern from the Trump administration as what happens with every bully, el poder empuja hasta donde encuentra resistencia. You know, power pushes until it encounters resistance. And in the areas where Trump has encountered resistance, he has tended to back off. So if American or multinational companies with interests in Mexico truly wanted to protect those interests, I would be much more vocal about it. And also form coalitions within the country and outside the country and mobilize sectors in the US that have interests in Mexico to go and knock on the White House's door. I mean, we saw it when Trump came out, when was it, 2 weeks ago, saying that he was going to pull out of Nafta. And then there was clearly an outcry and probably hundreds of calls flooded into the White House. And we've recently found out that there were people in the White House who called up Trudeau and Peña Nieto begging them to call Trump to ask him to stay in the agreement. So then Trump was able to say, oh, I really like them. They're really nice people. They asked me, so we're going to renegotiate instead of stepping out. So I think that if you create resistance, that will be much better for your agenda than simply staying silent and hoping for the best outcome. I think you're going to have to be much more proactive.
Mike, I'm sorry, we reached the time, but if Denise is willing to stay a few more minutes, you're okay, then I think we'll continue.
Mike Pacetic, PBS Online NewsHour. You and other elements of civil society are advocating really strong attacks on some strong vested interests. But you have also described a violent society which has its own ways of getting back at people. How safe do you and the other elements in the civil society feel at this moment?
I think my position, my answer to that question would be very different if I were a journalist or a public advocate or an activist in Chihuahua, Tamaulipas, Guerrero, Michoacán, or Oaxaca. If I were a journalist from the provinces. In that case, I probably wouldn't even be here. The Committee to Protect Journalists just released its report last week called No Excuse, where it outlined, as well as Article 19, how Mexico has become one of the most dangerous places to be a journalist and an activist. In 48% of the cases of aggressions against activists or journalists, the person responsible is someone in government. It's either the municipal president, or it's not just organized crime, or it's organized crime within the government. So I feel safe, or a relatively larger degree of safety, because I'm in Mexico City, because I'm affiliated to Reforma and Proceso and Foro TV, because I'm a binational, because I have friends here that I assume if something were to happen to me, you'd make a little bit of a fuss. I'm in a privileged position. This is not the privileged position of Miroslava Breach, my colleague at Proceso, who was gunned down in front of her adolescent son 2 months ago in Chihuahua. So I'm expressing a level of conveying a level of security, which is not the case for most people who are speaking truth to power, who are uncovering criminal links and criminal ties between drug traffickers and state and local officials. And I think that is the most dangerous area to do investigative reporting in Mexico today.
Thank you. Yes, sir, you've been very patient.
Thank you very much. Herbert Francisco Curry Arceo from the World Bank. Regarding decentralization, I'm wondering if you see any opportunities or any potential positive forces in terms of state governments, in terms of independent candidates at the state level, and the potential local responses to what have been, unfortunately, counterproductive for the nation as a whole.
Yeah. What's so fascinating about decentralization in Mexico is that it's a double-edged sword. In the cases of states where you have periods of a long period of alternancia, of different parties in power, where you've had a tradition of democratic movements against the PRI, for example, decentralization actually helps you. I mean, Javier Corral, my friend, would not be governor of Chihuahua today as a very independent-minded panista who didn't really win as a candidate of the National Action Party. He won because of the citizen-based coalition that he built. That wouldn't have happened had there not been decentralization. So decentralization helps states that have a tradition of alternancia and greater accountability. Chihuahua was the birthplace of oral trials, and it's a place where they're taking place more effectively. But decentralization is very bad in places where you haven't had alternancia, even a rotation of parties in power, because what's happened is that you built authoritarian archipelagos of party hardliners who govern, as Leo Zuckerman called it, as los nuevos virreyes, the new viceroys. And so decentralization has brought about the cases of Borge in Quintana Roo, Duarte in Chihuahua, the other Duarte in Chihuahua, Moreira in Coahuila, and 5 or 6 more, where governors basically despoiled their states, ran off with the money, or channeled it into other elections, and where what's happening in terms of national level democratization, you see inertia, you see opacity, you see clientelism, and entrenched corruption at the state level because of decentralization.
Yes, sir. You've been very patient. Yes. There's a microphone there.
Could you be maybe a little more specific about suggestions that you would make for building this broad coalition that's not there yet? What's step one, step two that hasn't been done that ought to be done?
One of the most toxic legacies of 71 years of dominant party rule, plus the last 5, it's a civil society composed of people who don't know their rights, and they don't know how to fight for them, and they don't know how to mobilize for them. Things that come naturally to you, that Tocqueville described in Democracy in America. This cognizance of rights and this, this education in the basic tenets of liberal democracy, of how a citizen has the right to oppose arbitrary authority and to mobilize, things that Americans know how to do, that are instinctive. Getting signatures, town halls, the indivisible movement that has emerged as a result of Trump's election, MoveOn.org, and so many more I could talk about. These are nascent initiatives in Mexico. We are just, we're beginning to learn how you do this, because for so many years we couldn't. Or if you did, you were killed or exiled or silenced or bought off. So we're taking baby steps. I'm part of 2 collectives. One is Fiscalía que Sirva, for an attorney general's office that works, and the other is Seguridad sin Guerra, to block the Ley de Seguridad Interior that would give greater latitude to the military. We have meetings on a weekly basis, and we're just figuring out how it is that you draw up legislation, how you lobby, at what time you send out press releases, when you do your conferencias de prensa, how to make sure that the media covers these things, how do you bring the business class in. This that you understand, we're just starting to figure out. And coalitions that come naturally to you of the environmental movement, of the women's movement, of scientists, so on, that emerge almost on a spontaneous basis. In Mexico, they're difficult to construct because you have a very clientelist-based state that can always buy off a group of your coalition, or that can offer a public office, or a Senate seat, or a governorship to members of your group. And so it's very difficult to create these coalitions. And I'd say the main obstacle that we face is that we find very few allies within the structure of the state itself. Here, citizen-based movements can find a Democratic congressman. They can find a receptive media. In Mexico, it's very difficult to find someone who will actually push your bill forward or to get the votes for it because there's no re-election. So people don't have to be responsive to their constituents. It's better to be responsive to a monopolist who will guarantee your political life, or to be responsive to the head of your parliamentary group, because discipline will be rewarded with a position. So we're starting to figure these things out, and they've been incredibly hard.
I hope all of you who are here this morning feel grateful that you braved the rain to come to what I think has been a real treat and a tremendously thought-provoking, informative session with Denise. It's really been a delight to listen to you. We've all learned a lot, You've left us with a lot to think about, and we really appreciate you coming to the dialogue. This is part of your home, for sharing your very profound insights and perspective this morning with us. Thank you very much, Denise.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Thank you very much.